What's going on, everyone? It's Adrian from Draft Diamond. We're back with another picks video. Now, in this video, I'm going to go over the main FanDuel slate for tonight, which is a 5-game slate. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So first of all, key injuries, guys who are questionable. A bunch of guys from the Pacers. You got Halliburton, Benedict Mathurin, and Aaron Nesmith, and also Obi Toppin. All right, and then you got Patrick Williams. He's questionable for the Bulls, and then Ayo Dosunmu is also questionable. So pay attention to these guys. Obviously, that have a huge impact on a bunch of Pacers players if, maybe two out of these four guys end up missing the game. But anyways, let's look at some guys who are out. So you got Siakam and Bruce Brown. They're both out. They're not going to make their debuts yet. And then you got Gafford and Pirtle who are both out. And then you got a bunch of guys from Memphis who have been out for a while now. But yeah, let me go ahead and refresh this and let's take a look at the top value plays for tonight. And first of all, you got Julius Randle. He's only $9,000 and he's going against this awful Washington defense. And actually, in his two games that he played against Washington earlier this year, he's averaging 50.65. So it's a really good matchup for him. He's going to be pretty heavily owned, which actually makes him a good candidate to be faded. And we'll go over some potential guys we could fade him for later on in this video. And then you got RJ Barrett. He's definitely starting to find his way for Toronto right now. And he's only $6,800. He's coming off a pretty good game last night. And actually, it's coming off of back-to-back 40-plus point games. And also, you got the Raptors. They just traded Siakam, and they still don't have Bruce Brown playing. So a lot of value for a lot of different players on Toronto. And then you got Shea Gilgeous-Alexander. They lowered his price down to $11,000, and this is actually a really good price for him because he's had back-to-back pretty subpar games. But $11,000 is a really good price for him. And Utah is not a very good defense, and they play a pretty fast pace. So this is a good opportunity for him to have a bounce back game. And then you got Sabonis going against the Pacers, who are a really bad defense. They play at a really fast pace, and Sabonis is on a really good stretch right now. He's averaging 52.68 over his last 10 games. So pretty good value for Sabonis. And then you got Luke Kennard, $4,800. Pretty much everyone is out for Memphis right now. They got no Derrick Rose, no Marcus Smart. You got Ja Morant, who's out for the season. So pretty good value there at $4,800 for Luke Kennard. And you got a couple of Raptor guys. Like I was saying earlier, they traded Siakam, and Bruce Brown isn't playing yet for them. So pretty good value for the Raptors players. All right, now as far as my top sleeper pick tonight, there's not a whole lot of guys that really jump out at you that could be, potential sleepers. But one guy who does is Jaden McDaniels for the Timberwolves. He's only $4,900, so it's a pretty decent price for him. He has a pretty decent floor because he's playing pretty big minutes. So there's no reason he shouldn't get you 20. But at $4,900, all he has to do is get you 29, and he's hitting 6x value. And there's not a whole lot of cheap guys tonight that have the potential to hit 6x value. So I really like Jaden McDaniels as a potential sleeper. But yeah, with that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at the first game of the night. You got the Bulls at the Raptors. Now, for Chicago, they allow the 12th fewest points per game, and they play at the third slowest pace. And then for Toronto, they allow the 13th most points per game, and they play at the 13th slowest pace. Now, for Chicago, you got all of the big three, DeRozan, Vucevic, and Levine. I think they're all worth picking up at their respective prices because each of them is capable of giving you 50 plus. But I'm not going to pick up any of these three guys together. Now, of these three guys, I would say the guy that I think has the most potential to pop is Vucevic at $8,000 because he's going against this Raptors team who are without Jakob Pertl, and they're rolling out pretty small lineups. So he does have, I think, from a matchup perspective, a pretty decent matchup tonight. So I'm not going to go crazy with any of these guys, but I'll throw one of each of them into a few lineups. Then you got Kobe White. I think he's a little bit too expensive at $7,400. I don't think he has that high of a ceiling. And for just $100 more, you could get Zach LaVine, who does have a higher ceiling. Caruso at $5,700. I think that's a little bit too expensive for him, unless Ayo Dosunmu ends up missing the game. Then Caruso becomes a lot more valuable. And he's actually coming off of decent back-to-back games, 40 and 28.1. But yeah, only if Dosunmu misses the game does Caruso become worth it. Drummond, he's a backup. That's too expensive for him. Now, Patrick Williams is questionable. If he ends up playing, is he worth picking up? I don't think so. He's coming back from injury. They're probably going to slowly work him back into the rotation. At $4,700, he'd have to give you around like 28. And I just don't think he's going to do that tonight. And Dosumu, if he plays, I don't think he's worth it at $4,600. Too many guys are healthy for Chicago right now. But yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at Toronto now. And for Toronto, you got a lot of decent value plays with no Siakam, who just got traded, and Bruce Brown is still out for them. So you got Scotty Barnes at $8,800. That's pretty good value for someone like him. If you take a look at his last 10 games, he's averaging just 35.73 over his last 10 games. So he's on a pretty bad stretch. But if you look at his season average, he's averaging 44.63 over the season. But now he has an opportunity to get back on track with no Siakam. And if you look at last game, last night against Miami, he's finished with 42 in a blowout. And that was, his first game without Siakam. So I think $8,800 is a really good price for Scotty Barnes. Then you got Emmanuel quickly at $7,600. Um, Maybe he's worth throwing into a few, but I think he's too expensive. He's been pretty consistent, but he hasn't had that huge game yet since getting traded to the Raptors. So I'm not crazy about quickly. RJ Barrett at $6,800. That's a great price for him. It looks like he's finally starting to catch his stride. Back to back 40 plus games for the Raptors, and now obviously with no Siakam, he has a better opportunity. And actually, 35.26, the only reason his projection isn't higher is because he's going against Chicago, who's a pretty good defense. If he was going against, like the Wizards or something, you would see his projection would probably be in the 40s with how he's trending recently. Then you got Dennis Schroeder, hasn't done much. $6,000 is too expensive for him. He pretty much lost his job to Emmanuel quickly. Gary Trent at $4,700. Um, that's a really good price for him. He had a good game last night, finished with 33.4 fantasy points, 28 actual points. So that's really good value for Gary Trent at $4,700. And he gets picked up by the optimizer. So maybe you consider fading him in a couple of lineups, but I'm not going to go crazy with fading Gary Trent. And the same actually applies to RJ Barrett. He gets picked up by the optimizer. So he's going to be pretty heavily owned. And, maybe fade him in one or two lineups, but I'm not going to go crazy with the Barrett fades because I think that's really good value for him. And then you got Thaddeus Young and Jonte Porter. With no Jakob Pertl, maybe you throw in one of these two guys into a lineup. Chris Boucher hasn't really been doing much since Pertl's got injured. And then you got Grady Dick. Do I like Dick tonight? Nah, I think I'm going to stay away from Dick tonight. He had a good first half last night, but then he ended up not even playing in the second half. $3,600 is really cheap, but he's just too risky. But yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at the next game. You got Washington at the Knicks. Now, Washington, as we know, has an awful defense. They're last in points per game allowed, and they play at the second quickest pace. Then you got the Knicks, on the other hand, who are a really good team defensively. They allow the fourth fewest points per game, and they play at the fourth slowest pace. Now, for Washington, you got no Gafford tonight. He's out. So, the rest of these guys from Washington are just so inconsistent. Maybe you throw in one player from Washington, um, but I'm not going crazy with anyone from Washington. You got Kuzma at $8,200. He's going against this really good Knicks defense, so I'm not going to go crazy with him. But maybe throw him into one or two lineups just in case he gives you 50 plus. But I seriously doubt it's going to be tonight against the Knicks. Then you got Tyus Jones, who's coming off a pretty decent game. And at $6,700, maybe you consider him in one or two lineups because he scored 40 plus in 6 different games this season. So he does have some decent potential there. But honestly, if I'm going to take anyone, I'd rather take Denny Avdia, who's $600 cheaper, who could easily outscore Tyus Jones. And he's coming off of 250 plus point games in the past 10 games. So I think he has a higher ceiling tonight than Tyus Jones. And then you got Jordan Poole, and similar to Tyus Jones, he's $6,700, so he's $600 more than Denny Avdia. So I'd have rather take from the Wizards Denny Avdia over Jordan Poole. He's just so up and down. I think $6,700 is too expensive for a guy that's averaging just 26.75 on the season. And then you got Marvin Bagley, who's probably going to get the start. You want to make sure you pay attention to the starting lineups and see if he does end up being the starter. But it looks like he's going to be the starter. And the optimizer actually does pick him up at that center spot at $5,000. That's a pretty decent price for a guy who is coming off a pretty decent game where he scored 20.3 points in just 12 minutes. So you got to think with more minutes, he could do a lot more tonight. So he's definitely worth picking up. And actually, that's why the optimizer picks him up. But maybe you consider fading him for another center. So I'm definitely going to do some Bagley fades because he does have a lot of downside risk. Then you got Koulibaly at $4,900. That's a decent price for him. He plays pretty decent minutes if you look at his game log here. But every time I seem to pick him up, kind of hoping for him to be a sleeper, he always does ends up doing nothing. So I'll throw him in one lineup tonight just in case. Um, but I'm not going crazy with him because I've learned my lesson with him. And that's pretty much it for Washington. No one else really worth picking up. But let's go ahead and take a look at the Knicks. Now, for the Knicks, like I mentioned earlier, you got Julius Randle. He's the top value play of the night going against this Wizards team. But maybe you consider fading him just because he's going to be so heavily owned. Fade him maybe for like a guy like Lauri Markkinen, who's only $100 more. It can easily outscore Randall, especially if this is a blowout and you got a guy like Randall sitting in the fourth quarter. So I like fading him for someone like a Lauri Markkinen. Otherwise, I'm going to have Randall in a bunch of lineups. And then you got Jalen Brunson at $8,900. I think that's a pretty good price for him going against this Washington defense. And he's kind of cooled down recently. But I think this is a good opportunity against this defense to have a bounce back game. So I like Brunson, and I'm going to have him in a bunch of lineups. But you want to pay attention to make sure if your lineup picks up Randall and Brunson together, try not to pick up both of them together because they're actually negatively correlated, and very rarely do they both go for 50 plus in the same game. And then you got Hartenstein, who's expensive at $7,700, but this is actually a decent matchup for him going against the Wizards. So maybe you throw him in one or two lineups, but I'm not going crazy with him at $7,700. Then you got Ananobi, DiVincenzo, and Josh Hart. I'm not crazy about any of these guys' prices. They really don't have that high of a ceiling, but maybe you throw in one out of these three guys into one of your lineups. Because you do think that out of those three guys, one of them is going to go off. But I'm not going crazy with these guys. And that's pretty much it for the Knicks. No one else really worth picking up. But let's go ahead and take a look at the next game. You got the Oklahoma City Thunder at Utah. Now, for Oklahoma City, they have an average defense and they play at the 10th fastest pace. And then you got Utah, they allow the eighth most points per game and they play at the seventh fastest pace. So for Oklahoma City, like I mentioned earlier, you got Shea Gilgeous-Alexander at $11,000. That's a really good price for him. They lowered his price because he's coming off of back-to-back pretty bad games. But going against this Utah defense and this quick pace at Utah, and also Oklahoma City plays at a pretty decent pace. So this could be a high-paced, high-scoring game. So this is a good opportunity for Shea Gilgeous to have a bounce-back game. But he is fade-worthy because if he gives you anything less than 50, then that's probably not going to cut it. And even if he does give you 50, that might not cut it either. So maybe you consider fading him for a guy like Halliburton, who is actually $700 cheaper if Halliburton actually ends up playing tonight. He's still questionable, so we're not sure what's going to happen there. But he is fade worthy. But still, I'm going to have a lot of Shea Gilgeous, obviously. Then you got Chet Holmgren. He's on a really bad stretch right now. If you look at his last four games, 31, 36, 33, 23. But I actually think this is a good opportunity for him to have a bounce back game. And they lowered his price at $8,100. So that's a pretty good price for Chet Holmgren, especially against his Utah defense. So I'm going to throw him into a few lineups just in case he has a bounce back game. And this is a pretty good matchup, and that's a pretty good price for him. And then you got Jalen Williams. I'm not crazy about his price at $7,800, but maybe you throw him into one or two lineups just in case he hit 6x, which would mean he'd have to score 47, which he's capable of doing. He's done that several times this season, but I'm not crazy about him at that price. And then everyone else for Oklahoma City, I think that their prices are way too expensive. Josh Giddey just doesn't play enough minutes. Dort is not very productive at $5,200, and then everyone else is way too expensive. But let's go ahead and take a look at Utah now. And like I mentioned earlier, I like the possibility of fading Julius Randle for Lauri Markkinen, who's only $100 more. And Markkinen is on a great stretch right now. He's averaging 47 over his last 5 games, and he could easily outscore a guy like Julius Randle tonight. But really, everyone else's value on Utah kind of sucks. Jordan Clarkson at $7,200. I think that's too expensive for him. Maybe you consider someone like Sexton because he's on a pretty decent stretch right now, averaging 34.8 over his last 5 games. But I'm not going crazy with anyone else from Utah. I think their prices are way too expensive and they just don't have enough value. Okay, now that takes us to the next game. You got Memphis at Minnesota. Now for Memphis, they allow the 13th fewest points per game, and they play at the 12th fastest pace. And then you got Minnesota. They're the best defense in the league. They allow the fewest points per game, and a lot of that is in large part to Rudy Gobert. And then they play at the ninth slowest pace. Okay, so this is actually the game with the lowest over under of the evening. Should be a pretty low scoring game. Now you got Memphis, who's just decimated by injury. Uh, Jaron Jackson at $8,300. That's a pretty decent price for him, and he's on a pretty decent stretch right now, averaging 44 over his last five. But this is a bad matchup for him tonight, going against Rudy Gobert and this Minnesota defense, which is why he's only projected for 38.8%. But he is worth one or two lineups, possibly fading a guy like Julius Randle for Jaron Jackson, who is capable of outscoring Julius Randle, and is $700 cheaper. So maybe you consider doing that in one or two lineups. Otherwise, this is just too bad of a matchup for him. Then you got Vince Williams, who is playing well right now. He's got back to back 40 plus point games. Um, but they raised his price to $6,500. Maybe you throw him in one or two lineups just in case he repeats. Otherwise, I think that's a pretty high price, especially against this Minnesota defense. And I think the same applies to Xavier Tillman, GG Jackson. As soon as these guys have a good game, you got FanDuel raises their price to the 6,000s, and I think that's just way too expensive for these guys. But Luke Kennard, on the other hand, he's $4,800. He's been pretty consistent. He scored 20 plus in each of his last four games. So he's pretty decent value. And I guess, if he doesn't score 30, then FanDuel doesn't raise your price. But the second you score 30 plus, FanDuel raises your price to at least $5,000. That's why he's under 5,000. But that's a really good value for him. But maybe consider fading him in a few lineups just because he's going to be pretty heavily owned. And that's basically it. I don't think there's anyone else worth picking up. Zaire Williams at $4,400 doesn't have that high of a ceiling. Now, they actually just signed Scottie Pippen Jr. to a 2-year contract. He's minimum priced at $3,500. Now, I'm not going to risk it, but if you have any inside information that they're going to play him a decent amount of minutes tonight, definitely let me know. All right, now let's go ahead and take a look at Minnesota. So you got Anthony Edwards. He's definitely worth playing in a few lineups. He could easily give you 50 plus at $9,300. It's not a bad price. Then you got Karl Anthony Towns at $8,400. I think that's a little bit too expensive for him. Maybe you consider fading Julius Randle for Karl Anthony Towns in a lineup, but I'm not going to go crazy with him at that price. Now, maybe you want to consider Rudy Gobert at that center spot at $8,200. He scored 43 plus in his last four games. So maybe you consider him in a few. I'm definitely going to lock him into the center spot in a couple of lineups. Then you got Mike Conley at $5,600. It's decent value, but I'm not crazy about his ceiling. I don't think he has that high of a ceiling. You look at his game log, and his best game in the last 10 games is 34.6. So I'm not crazy about his upside. So I may consider fading Mike Conley because the optimizer actually ends up picking up Mike Conley into the default number one lineup. So I'm definitely going to do some Mike Conley fades. And that's pretty much it. I already went over Jaden McDaniels and why he's my sleeper for tonight. But yeah, that's it for Minnesota. So let's go ahead and take a look at the last game of the night. You got Indianapolis at Sacramento. Now, this game actually has the highest over under of the evening at 247.5. Both teams play at a really fast pace. You got the Pacers, they play at the fastest pace and they allow the second most points per game. And then you got the Kings, they play at the ninth fastest pace and they allow the ninth most points per game. So expect a really fast paced, high scoring game tonight. Now, for Indianapolis, you got a whole lot of guys who are questionable. Tyrese Halliburton might make his return tonight. And like I mentioned earlier, if he does end up making his return, he's definitely worth playing, potentially fading Shea Gilgeous-Alexander for Tyrese Halliburton in a few lineups, just in case Halliburton outscores him and he's $300 cheaper. I actually said he was $700 cheaper, but I was wrong. He's $300 cheaper. But he definitely has the ability to outscore Shea Gilgeous-Alexander. Then you got Miles Turner and Jalen Smith. I'm not crazy about either of them because they're splitting minutes. Now, Jalen Smith at $5,000, he definitely is the guy with better value, but I'm just not crazy about him because he just doesn't have that high of a ceiling because of the fact that he's splitting minutes with Miles Turner. Then you got Benedict Mathurin, who's questionable. If he does end up playing, he's worth throwing into a few lineups because they just traded Bruce Brown and they still don't have Siakam yet. So he might be worth playing in a few. But if he misses the game, then maybe you want to consider someone like a Buddy Hield. Neesmith, if he plays at $5,200, is way too expensive for him. Nembhard, $5,200 is way too expensive for him unless Halliburton misses the game. TJ McConnell at 6,600, even if Halliburton misses the game, I think that's too expensive for him. But yeah, just make sure you pay attention to these injuries. But yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at Sacramento now. So you got Sabonis and De'Aaron Fox. They're both definitely worth playing, especially against this Pacers defense. You could play both of them together. And as a matter of fact, I encourage you to play them both together because they're actually positively correlated. And one interesting statistic, when Sabonis has an above average game, De'Aaron Fox averages 47.8 fantasy points per game. And when Sabonis has a below average game, Fox averages just 41.9 points per game. So, like I said, they're both positively correlated. So, definitely consider picking both of them up together. Malik Monk, maybe you throw him into a few because of his upside. He's had these crazy big games before, but I'm not crazy about him with that price. But if you do throw him into a lineup, make sure you don't throw him and Fox into the same lineup together because these guys are actually negatively correlated. They've actually never had a game where Fox scored 50 and Monk scored 40 in the same game. That just hasn't happened all season long. So they're negatively correlated. And actually, the same applies to Keegan Murray. Maybe you could throw him into one or two lineups just, because every now and then he has these monster games. But similar to Malik Monk, he's actually negatively correlated with De'Aaron Fox. So I wouldn't throw Keegan Murray into the same lineup as De'Aaron Fox. Um, then you got Kevin Herter, Harrison Barnes. I think those prices are too high for them. Then you got Trey Lyles at $4,300. We only have him projected for 18.65 fantasy points. But actually, even with that, he gets picked up by the optimizer. But I doubt that's going to hold up by the end of the night. Once some more injuries come in and there's some more value out there, I think the optimizer is not going to end up picking Trey Lyles by the end of the night. But if it still does, I definitely think he's worth fading because he doesn't have that high of an upside. But yeah, that's pretty much all of the games for tonight. Now let's go ahead and run that lineup back just to see what we're working with. So you got Shea Gilders Alexander, Mike Conley, Gary Trent, Luke Kennard, RJ Barrett, Scotty Barnes, Julius Randle, Trey Lyles, and Marvin Bagley. So, anyways, let me know what you guys think. If you're not already subscribed to Draft Time, make sure you go ahead and sign up for a free 7-day trial. And good luck to everyone tonight.